Your life is meaningless. You wake up at 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning. You drag yourself to the car or to the train and begin the long commute. You stare at the screen for 8 hours and you talk to colleagues who you otherwise would never talk to. You commute back home and spend a few hours mindlessly scrolling through YouTube or Reddit. Eventually, with no real relaxation, you lie down for bed and get maybe 6 hours of sleep, preparing for the grind again tomorrow. In the background of this, it's always apparent to you that what you're doing seems to be without meaning. Why am I fulfilling society's expectations? You might be thinking. Why? What is the ultimate end of all of this misery? You have money. You have a girlfriend. You even have a nice middle-class house. You're successful, yet you're not fulfilled. Every single day, you feel like you're swimming through this burning tar. This sluggishness, this burning sluggishness as you approach the next task. Why don't I just lie down and sleep? Why don't I just do that? When I'm in that state, at least the pain is less. All of us were told throughout our childhoods that we could just pursue our dreams and we'd be happy. We were told implicitly through this that our lives were there ultimately for our own enjoyment. A great distilling of this principle is found in the anti-natalist philosopher David Benatar. Without being aware of it, he actually shows forth this principle in its barest form in his article, Why It Is Better Never to Come Into Existence. He articulates this in 4 separate points. Number 1, that the presence of pain is bad, and number 2, that the presence of pleasure is good. Further, he says that the absence of pain is good, even if that good is not enjoyed by anyone. Further, he states that the absence of pleasure is not bad unless there is somebody for whom this absence is a deprivation. Therefore, because the presence of pain is always evil, and the absence of good is neither good nor evil, it follows that the best case scenario for a person is to never exist. Now, I think a lot of modern people would find this very amenable to their worldview. After all, there is a certain pseudo-satisfaction that comes from pursuing your will, which is something that we've been taught all through our childhoods. However, I think that many of you who are watching will notice some really serious problems with this particular view of life. For example, I think many people would observe that pain is sometimes necessary to acquire some good, even if there's not necessarily any pleasure in the good gained. Likewise, when we consider justice, isn't it sometimes the case that to restore a balance of justice that there must be some pain meted out on the person that's guilty? Whether this be the restitution that is provided by prison or by any other means. Additionally, some people might observe that actually non-existence is evil in some cases. For example, let's look at St. Augustine of Hippo's view that evil is actually a lack of being. He states this opinion in his Confessions, but he also makes a very clear case for it in his Enchiridion. For what is that which we call evil but the absence of good? In the bodies of animals, disease and wounds mean nothing but the absence of health. For when a cure is effected, that does not mean that the evils which were present, namely the diseases and wounds, go away from the body and dwell elsewhere, they altogether cease to exist. For the wound or disease is not a substance, but a defect in the fleshly substance. The flesh itself being a substance, and therefore something good, of which those evils, that is, privations of the good which we call health, are accidents. However, I think the biggest issue with Benatar's argument is that I think that it's essentially self-refuting. To restate Benatar's case in a different way, what he is basically saying is that for things to be maximally good, there must be nothing. As the perception of pleasure or pain is ultimately contingent on the nature of the thing experienced, it follows by the same logic that if there's no nature, then there's an absence of pleasure and no pain, which is his ideal situation. Now let's consider this in light of Benatar's own principle. For it exists, we can think about it, we can derive pleasure and pain from it, and so, therefore, his principle actually fails to be maximally good according to its own set of parameters. Therefore, if, as we can extract from Benatar's principles, that the avoidance of pain is the highest good, and his principle causes pain, then it follows that his principle is actually contradicting itself by causing the thing that it seeks to avoid. Strangely enough, it seems that Benatar almost has an awareness that his principle is causing people pain. Honestly, I think if he were consistent, he would just burn all of his papers. But Nonetheless, they're still there on JSTOR, so I'll link it in the description. And so that leaves us with purposes of life that are somehow different from pure self-satisfaction. But what could satisfy us in life that isn't pleasure? To decide what this is going to be, we need to talk about the meaning of the root of the word satisfaction, which is the Latin word satis. It has many different meanings, but one of those meanings is a state of filled, or being filled. On the basis of this fact, I think that the highest good, that true satisfaction that we can obtain, is through the complete fulfillment of all of our faculties, be they of the body or be they of the mind. This is not actually the same as pleasure, because it turns out that the pleasure of some organs can actually cause worse problems for other organs. For example, let's look at some of the conclusions that St. Alphonsus Liguori came to. Alphonsus wrote in the 18th century regarding many moral topics of moral theology, but what we're going to focus on now is lust, which is the disordered desire for sexual experience. He writes as follows about the psychological consequences of sexual impurity. He speaks in numerous ways of a certain blindness of the mind, that overpowering of the intellective faculty by the impurity which they experience. He also speaks of an arrogance of the person, where he continually prefers himself over things which are superior to himself. He even speaks about a certain hatred of the divine, because the divine opposes the fulfillment of that particular appetite. Therefore, we must consider how to fulfill all of these faculties in a way that makes sense, and I think that the best place to start is to talk about the highest faculty, which in my opinion is the mind. This is first and foremost because the mind directs the body, and not the body the mind. The mind is also not physical, because we can know for certain what our minds are saying. But we can't know the physical world around us. There's always ambiguity of interpretation. Likewise, we have a single consciousness and a single intellect, which is indivisible by virtue of its singularity. You either have consciousness or you don't, yet the rest of our body is divisible, and so it's subject to decay, which actually means that not only is our mind not physical, it's also undecayable, that is to say, in a sense, eternal. This doesn't mean that our souls pre-exist our bodies, but what it does mean is that our mind can persist after death, as St. Thomas Aquinas, as Aristotle, and many, many others, in fact the plurality of philosophers throughout history believed. However, in a sense, at least to act exteriorly, the body is necessary for the mind, and therefore the body must be considered to have certain virtues in light of the mind. Therefore, I think it's now the best time to discuss the highest particular qualities that each of these faculties can possess, starting with the mind. I start by agreeing with Aristotle and Aquinas that the highest particular thing that the mind can possess is wisdom, which is the knowledge of causes. This highest knowledge, the highest form of cause that you can get, is the cause of the existence of the universe, which is God. This is because all things are united insofar as they exist. This can be physical things which pass away, or non-physical things which are universal and apply at all times. But these universals, these non-physical things, which interact with each other, nonetheless need a basis in something, and that is why there must be one pure existence. If there were two pure existences, there would need to be something differentiating them, but since to exist is simply to exist and not much else, or in fact nothing else, they can't be distinct. Therefore there's one existence, and because the consciousness of man, which we've already described is indivisible and eternal, exists in its own right and isn't just like a combination of brain synapses, it therefore follows that, in a sense, this existence must possess intelligence, and hence we call it God and not simply existence. However, as Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange points out in his magnum opus on the 3 ages of the interior life, wisdom does not suffice, because wisdom does not touch the will or any other faculty beyond the mind. A philosopher with a powerful intellect, though he has a correct idea of God, first cause of the universe and last end, may not be a good man, a man of good will. At times he may be even a very bad man. That which is true is the good of the intellect, but it is not the good of the entire man, not the whole good of man. So in light of this, what is the highest virtue? The answer to this is charity, which is known as the love of God and neighbour, but it's more accurately expressed as the willing of the greater being of your neighbour, and the proper reverence and love of God. It is good for the body because it tempers vanity and it tempers inordinate pleasure. It is good for the mind because it destroys pride and it focuses study on those things which serve its final end. And finally, it's good for the will, because through God's action in the will, which is where charity comes from, good works come forth. So how do you acquire this good? It's actually quite simple. First of all, if you're not baptised, go to your local Roman Catholic church, go and enter the RCIA program and get baptised. If you're already baptised and already in communion with the Church of Rome, then the next step is to go to your local Catholic church and to confess your sins and start living a proper sacramental life or frequent communion and frequent confession. The next thing that you should do, and you should probably do now anyway, is to begin to pray at least 15 minutes a day to fulfill the precept of justice. This can be done with a rosary or by any other means. And you should also begin to start reading. I would recommend very strongly books like Ways of Mental Prayer, and also Lives of the Saints. One of the ones that I really like is The Life of St. Anthony of the Desert, but there are many. Another thing that might be beneficial, especially for the wisdom, would be to watch people on YouTube. So, for example, there is Matt Fradd's channel, and there is also Ascension Presents, and also mine. In order to get viewed, this channel requires people to watch through the videos and to concurrently click on more and more videos. And so, if you stick on this channel and continue watching content, that's going to help my retention rates, which is going to grow the channel. And on top of commenting, liking and subscribing, as I'm sure you've heard many times, this would be very useful for me because I'd like to grow this channel. And so with that said, I'd appreciate if you could click the video that has been recommended to you on this end screen. And in light of that, I'd like to thank you for watching all of this content. And I hope you have a wonderful day, and goodbye.